6.5 hours later.
Hello! In this meeting, we're gonna try to confer about assessing speaking. So let's get started. Okay, so when we're talking about assessing speaking, it's actually quite a problematic issue because we do not really think of it as an easy job because, speaking skill is actually part of productive skill, and that's the thing that is quite hard to assess for most language teachers. So we're gonna try to talk about it further and how teachers could develop a speaking test for their class. Okay, so first of all, we're gonna try to understand the nature of speaking itself. So what is speaking? Speaking is a multi-dimensional thing. It is worth noting that speaking is a multi-dimensional thing. And what is meant by multi-dimensional? It means that it covers a wide range of aspects. It has several elements to it. For example, it has context, it has the speaker, the identity of the speaker, of course, and then the audience, and many other things that contribute to the nature of speaking itself. And the second one is a productive skill. We can easily distinguish speaking from listening, for example, in a way that speaking is a productive skill while listening is a receptive skill, right? So, what is meant by productive here is that speaking has some sort of observable evidence to be measured when we're talking about assessment, right? So it means that what makes assessing speaking quite difficult is how we can measure the evidence, how we can use the evidence of speaking to show or to demonstrate the proficiency of the speaker. And we're going to try to reveal how it can be constructed. And then the next one is the contextual. So what is meant by contextual? Contextual here means that speaking is a skill that involves context or the settings. When we are talking to somebody, we're gonna think of when we're talking, and then what topic are we talking about, and then when are we talking, right? And that is the information about context that we need to include when we are speaking. And then lastly, speaking is a social skill because it involves other people, right? So when we're speaking, you're not just talking to yourself, but you're talking to other people. And that's when speaking is considered as a social skill. According to Brown in 2004, there are mainly 5 types of speaking performance. And those types start from the basic type to the most advanced type. So here we can see that the first one we have imitative. So imitative is when the speaker imitate the speaking performance of other people. So you can imagine when you were born, you might start to imitate your parents speaking, right? And that's when the production of the speaking itself it's quite limited. Usually it focuses on words or phrases or sentences, right? And then there's no focus on the language itself. It more focuses on the forms of the language, right? And then to the next stage, we get to the intensive. Intensive speaking is, the performance that focuses on the language itself. So, for example, when you learn how to imitate, later on, you're going to learn how to pay attention to your language. You're going to be paying attention to the words that you are uttering or the sentences that you are producing. And that's when you have the intensive performance of speaking. And next, we have responsive, and it involves interaction, right? In responsive type of speaking, we're responding to an utterance or to sentences spoken by other people. And in that case, we have some sort of interaction with that other person. However, compared to the next type, which is interactive, responsive is still quite limited in terms of the length of the utterances or the sentences that we choose. And in the next type, which is interactive type of speaking performance, we have a relatively longer utterances. So interactive is like the next stage of responsive. And finally, the most advanced type of speaking performance is extensive. That's when we learn how to produce long stretch of language or uh, lengthy utterances in our speech, and it's usually a monologue. So for example, you can imagine when you are delivering a speech in front of an audience, for example, or when you are um, doing a storytelling in front of a certain audience, and that's when you are performing extensive speaking. And when we have different types of speaking performance, we also have different types of activities to assess speaking. So you may think of activities like interview, paraphrasing, role playing, oral presentation, debates, and of course many other types of activities like games or like um, other kinds of activities that we usually have, right? So when we are talking about the formats of the speaking, there are various options that we can take. And then the next question is related to what to assess, right? When we know how to assess, we're going to think of what to assess. So that's when we ask questions about the purpose of the test itself. When we are designing a speaking test, we're going to think of why do we assess? Why do we test speaking? And then after you have some sort of purpose about the test, you're going to start planning the test, right? You're going to plan the test. So after you have the purpose, you're going to think of the target test takers, right? Why they take the test, and then uh, next you're going to think of another things like the test procedures, right? Here you have the test procedures and also the scoring procedures. So those procedures are in the test blueprints that we need to design. So here, the third one, we have the scoring procedures and also the standards. So we also need to set the standards for our speaking test, right? And then perhaps we also need to think of the rubrics or the answer key, for example. But uh, in this case, speaking is a productive skill, so it would be very much likely that we'll develop rubric instead of answer key, right? And then the next one, we might think of selecting the materials for the speaking test. We might try to adopt or adapt certain materials that is relevant to the test taker's level of proficiency, right? We shouldn't be selecting materials that are too easy or too difficult for them, right? We need to select materials that are on the right, level of proficiency for our speaking test. And then after we're planning on the test format that we're going to be delivering to the test takers, we're going to also be thinking about the aspects to be tested, right? So that's when you might think of aspects like grammar, pronunciation, vocabulary, nonverbal aspects like gestures or eye contact, right? And then you might also think of fluency or conversational skill. because after all, it's a conversation, right? It can be a conversation between the speaker and somebody else, the interlocutor, right? Or it might be a conversation between the speaker and the audience. And then you might think of other aspects like the pragmatic competence, right? So the pragmatic competence is the ability for the speaker to deliver or to convey his or her intended message. And then we also have the sociolinguistic skill, the ability of the speaker to distinguish different registers and genres of text. And then we also have the content, and that's I believe is a very important thing because after all we need to consider the message, the the content of our speech, right? So what do I want to talk about all of these? Basically, those elements will provide you with the criteria for the rubrics. So when you're designing a test and then you're designing a scoring rubric, you're going to need to select several criteria to include to your scoring rubric. And those criteria will be your foundations of scoring, right? So you're going to score, you're going to give some scores to your students or your test takers based on those criteria. And you might think of different types of speaking tests like TOEFL or IELTS or Cambridge ESOL, right? So those different tests, they assess different aspects of speaking, right? For example, in TOEFL, you might have delivery and then the use of language, and then the topic or the content in this case, right? As three main elements to be assessed. And then in speaking, you're going I mean, in IELTS, you're going to have different aspects of assessment, right? You're going to have things like fluency, coherence, and then lexical resource, grammatical range, and accuracy and pronunciation. So different types of tests will have different aspects to be assessed. And that's also the case with your own speaking test. When you are designing a speaking test for a group of students or test takers, you're going to be selecting a number of criteria from those wide range of options that you have. And of course, the selection will have to be based on the nature of your speaking test and also the nature of your, your test takers. So who are the test takers and why they are taking the test? And that's the end of this video about developing your own speaking test. And I hope that what I've been talking about in this video can be useful for you to design your own speaking test. If you have any question, write your question in the comment section. Bye bye.
We can still have fun for